Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, respected lecturers, researchers, students, and everyone present. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh, and a very warm welcome to the public lecture entitled Navigating the Perils of Urbanization, Gentrification and Displacement. This program is jointly organized by Khazanah Research Institute, London School of Economics and Political Science, and the Kulliyyah of Architecture and Environmental Design, International Islamic University, Malaysia. My name is Siti Nur Ifa, and I'll be serving as your master of ceremony for today's program. To seek blessings for today's event, I would like to invite Brother Muhammad Fikram Hanif to lead the dua recitation. Please welcome.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alamin. Wassalatu wassalamu ala ashrafil anbiya'i wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Ya Allah, Ya Rahim, on this blessed morning, in conjunction with this program, we beseech and grateful towards you in favor of all the infinite blessings you have given us. Your humble servants to live a life always seeking your pleasure. We seek your blessing for the smooth running of this event, from the beginning till the end. We seek your guidance to steer clear of events that will be detrimental to the progress of this event. Ya Allah, Ya Rahman, please bless us with your tawfiq and hidayat. Please guide our university, the International Islamic University Malaysia, to greatness, peace, glory, and prosperity in this world and the hereafter. Make us to be responsible intellectuals. Grant us valuable knowledge that will be beneficial to mankind in order to gain your mardatillah. Make us your righteous servants that follow your commands and turn away from sinful acts. Please forgive us for all the wrong that we have done. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار صلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين.
Amin, amin, ya Rabbal Alamin. Thank you to Brother Fikram for the meaningful dua. Without further ado, it is now my honor to invite the Dean of Kulliyyah of Architecture and Environmental Design, Professor Town Planner Dr. Mariana Muhammad Osman, to deliver her welcoming remarks. With all due respect, please welcome.
Thank you very much. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. And a very good morning and a warm welcome to everyone. Distinguished guests, our esteemed speaker, Professor Hyun Shin, from the London School of Economic and Political Science. Our moderator, Dr. Nofariza Mustafa, Research Associate from Khazanah Research Institute. Dr. Suraya Ismail, Head of Khazanah Research Institute. Representative and colleague from KRI, faculty members, researchers, students, ladies and gentlemen. It is my great pleasure on behalf of the Kulliyyah of Architecture and Environmental Design, International Islamic University, Malaysia, to welcome all of you to this important public lecture entitled Navigating the Perils of Urbanization, Gentrification and Displacement. First of all, I would like to express our sincere appreciation to Khazanah Research Institute for this valuable collaboration with KAED, IIUM, partnership with such as of this program is very essential in strengthening meaningful academic discourse and also connecting research with the pressing reality faced by our city and community today. I would like to also extend our special welcome to our distinguished speaker, Professor Hyun Shin from the London School of Economic and Political Science, whose scholarship on urban transformation, displacement, housing, and social justice has contributed significantly to global conversation on urban studies. We are deeply honored by your presence here in IIUM. As educator, urban planner, architect, and policymaker, we witness firsthand how urbanization acts as a double-edged sword. On one hand, it is undeniable engine for economic growth, modernization, and opportunity, but on the other hand, rapid and also unchecked urban development often comes with a steep human cost. It can inevitably marginalize the very people who build the social and cultural foundation of our cities, leading to displacement and the erosion of the long-standing communities. Urbanization continues to shape the futures of society across the world, including Malaysia. While city remains center of opportunity, innovation, and economic growth, they also bring difficult questions about inequality, affordability, identity, and also the right to remain within the community people for have long called home. Gentrification and displacement are not merely planning on or economic issue. They are deeply human issue. They affect social cohesion, cultural continuation, access to housing, and ultimately the dignity and well-being of communities. As planners, architect, urban designer, policymaker, and also public, we carry collective responsibility to ensure that development does not come at the cost of exclusion or marginalization. The question that stands before us today is not how to stop development, but rather how do we balance development with equality, inclusivity, and also social justice? How do we ensure that our skyline grow taller, but our community are not left behind? At KAED, we strongly believe that the built environment must serve humanity ethically and also responsibility. In line with IIUM mission of integration, Islamization, and comprehensive excellence, we hope that the program will inspire deeper reflection on how planning and government can better balance progress with compassion, resilience, and also community well-being. Following the lecture, we will have a fireside conversation moderated by Dr. Noor Fariza. Sorry. I highly encourage all of you to participate and hopefully ask questions. I hope today's lectures and discussion will encourage productive dialogue and also future collaboration among academics, practitioners, students, and also policymakers. Before I conclude, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to KRI for coordinating this vital platform, to Professor Shin for traveling to be with us, and also to everyone, the audience, for dedicating your morning to this important dialogue. Thank you very much. Welcome to IIUM.
Thank you, Professor Mariana, for the inspiring welcoming remarks. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall now proceed with the main session for today's program. To continue the program, it is with deepest respect we welcome our speakers for today, Professor Hyun Shin, to share his insight. Please welcome.
It's truly a humbling experience to receive such a big welcome, and also to be standing here and to give this talk to you all about this topic that I care a lot. I was in this very exciting kind of small gathering last night, and where there were many students and other practitioners, I would imagine, who were coming to a reading group. They was discussing the very issue of gentrification last night, and I think that gave me a really great awareness and understanding that there are probably people of your people who are about the same age and having probably experience of many of you. Really coming together to really think about what it means to reflect upon the changes that they encounter in a city like KL, and truly caring about about their city, their homes and the people. And I think that's probably the main topic that we hope to consider today in this talk about gentrification and displacement. So I was kind of thinking of a bit more kind of a smaller gathering, and this is actually great to really have a chance, and I mean, when I said small gathering, I was kind of hoping that we have a few more discussions and more feedback coming from you, and also me having a chance to hear how you think about this very issue of urban development, redevelopment, regeneration, displacement, and so on. So I hope this is not going to be just a one-way kind of communication from me and from the speakers to you guys, but also coming me and others, and also having a chance to hear from you, why you are, what you are thinking about this, and what comes to your mind as you, try to relate what I shared today with you to your own experience. So I hope that the fireside chat that is being planned also has a chance to really get all the comments and questions from you, and then use that as a way of kind of thinking more collectively about this very issue. So let me start, and I try to make sure that my talk is not going to occupy the entire 2 hours. I mean, hopefully, and I was aiming for 40 minutes, so hopefully that will give us a chance to discuss. And I know every speaker says, I'll give you a 40-minute talk, and then it goes on over more than an hour. I make sure it doesn't happen today. So let me just put my watch on the table. So this is probably just to give you a sense of why we are discussing this and what this topic is about. So on the one hand, we are looking at this process that is known as gentrification, that does produce displacement, and the thinking about displacement is at the very heart of this conversation about gentrification. And this is important because that process is referring to what we encounter as as the changes to urban space and the livelihood that does really alter the urban life by reshaping neighborhoods and social fabrics that we are part of. It's also important talk, and also quite delicate and sensitive, largely because the talk about gentrification does involve this consideration of power and inequality. Largely because, when you think of who gets displaced and who's displacing them, who is pursuing this change, which comes at the expense of social fabric, livelihood, it's a difficult question. You are basically involving this issue of the power of developers, the power of the government, or the power of community, or the power of those home buyers who are really having a stake. And everyone has a say in this process. Everyone has an agenda that they bring into the process. And it's often the question of whose agenda gets highlighted, prioritized. And this is not simply a kind of a collegial conversation you have over dinner table or coffee table. And therefore, it's really the issue of power contestation, and therefore inequality. Everyone is not kind of treated equally in this process, and that's definitely a difficult question. Everyone probably often tries to avoid, but they cannot avoid the process because the whole urban process that is going to be leading to gentrification and displacement is very real. It's happening, right? And that also means what it means to talk about the right to the city, something that you may come across in the literature, but maybe in the media. Basically, to put this simply, basically the right to stay put where you are, to pursue your own well-being in the way that you expect them to be, rather than being imposed upon by some other people, right? You having the full ownership of the changes that are going to impact your own life, and that is not again cannot be taken for granted, right? You have to fight for it, you have to struggle for it, you have to voice out for it. Otherwise, you're not going to be spoon-fed the right to the city or the right, and therefore it's something you also need to struggle to recognize and also come to try to reflect and critically engage and come to have a greater sense of awareness. So these are all part of the conversations that come with the topic of gentrification and displacement. So some of you may find it a little difficult and also uncomfortable, but that's precisely the point of having this kind of conversation in a lecture room. And one thing I always kind of say at the start of new academic year, especially during my time as the head of departments, on the first day, we welcome all 400 new students in a large lecture theater where I stand and welcome them. One thing I say is the teachers at the LSE, and I'm sure this is the same for teachers here at IIUM, we are not here to make you feel comfortable. We are here as teachers to make you feel uncomfortable, to make you kind of challenge your own existing wisdom, the things that you are thinking about up until you reach the classroom. And you are in the classroom really to think and to really challenge yourself. Is what I think is what I'm thinking, and something that can be kept unchanged and something that seems basically you have to ask yourself, and many situations through the learning process, through the encounters with real life, you're basically creating a distance between what you used to know and what you came to understand. And that creating a distance is a great thing. That's why we are learning and we are kind of engaging in this conversation. And I hope this conversation that we are going to have today about gentrification and displacement is part of that process of unlearning and relearning. Now, of course, we can also think about who the city belongs to. So this one again comes with a lot of considerations. On the one hand, the city that you're part of, I think it's important to understand the city is the result of collective action. Right? It's not the result of planners. Of course, planners are important. Architecture are important, but also government, and of course, government officials are important, and politicians are important. Residents are as important as all of these people. Visitors who may migrate and work while living elsewhere, they all come to produce something and contribute to the city. So it's probably important to understand the city itself is the outcome of this collective creation by everyone who has a stake. And this is precisely why the talk of gentrification and displacement is important. In this process of urban change, some of these contributors who made a difference to how the city has been shaping are coming to have much less voice, coming to have much less chance of influencing the change, and only having a greater chance of being influenced by the changes that are happening around them. And therefore, this is probably a topic that is going to really allow us to think about what it means to really consider urban transformation. That should be more equal, less unequal, and also should be more inclusive rather than being exclusive, especially when it comes to not the consuming the changes, but about producing the change and about making decisions about the change. And that requires people really to have active participation. So there are many already in the city who are already actively participating. A good example is developers, right? Developers are always actively participating in the city making. They go around every time they come across with an urban space that seems to have a chance to gain more profit. Then they really think about how am I going to go about to finance this and to really think bring in a great architect who can design a new form, bringing in all sorts of experts and tech and so on to really make things happen so that they can really reap the benefits. So they really work actively to make the change. The same goes to politicians as well. But I think this is where the active urban participation really is going to be an important topic for those people who are seemingly individualized, who are seemingly less organized. The large, the urban masses, people like you, people like us, who have something to say, but who don't really feel like they have a space to speak about, or they feel like we are not really invited to speak about. And this is probably where we need to think about how we can promote more active participation among people who are at the moment less participating. So So every talk about gentrification starts with this quote. So I have to probably do the same ritual, as well. Of all the kind of social science concepts, probably gentrification is one of those in a few concepts where you can identify the origin of where the concept was being introduced. So this is basically the most cited in a definitional sentences that you may come across in any literature on gentrification, where they basically refer to the scholar Ruth Glass, who spent a bit of time at LSE before moving to University College London, who was basically thinking about the urban change in post-war Britain in the 1950s and think about how neighborhoods were changing, especially in inner city London district called Islington. And what she observed was, hang on, this neighborhood that used to be very much a working class neighborhood has been gradually changing into a middle class neighborhood. And this change was really pursued by the middle classes who were purchasing the working class homes, renovating them to meet the taste of their own living. And what was initially like a house by house kind of change, eventually becoming a neighbor scale change, and therefore completely changing the characteristic of the neighborhood, which means basically the urban space that was occupied by middle working class and families becoming the space for middle class and working class and families being basically driven away from the neighborhood. So she was kind of looking at this and trying to understand why this was happening, and also what was happening initially, why this was happening later on, and also eventually kind of thinking of how the city has become increasingly unequal, right? The whole unequal process of neighborhood production, urban space production, that was really serving the interest of those more affluent people at the expense of the poorer or working class who were driven away. And she was kind of using that experience as a way of thinking about the unequal process of urban changes, and using the word gentry, which is a bit more British and localized in expression, to refer to in a sort of sarcastic way, to refer to them as a landed gentry, and then kind of using that as a way of coining this term gentrification. So this gentrification definition, when it was first emerging, describes working class neighborhoods changing due to wealthier residents moving in, first identified in this publication that came out in 1964. And then kind of using this term gentry as landed elite as a way of describing the process. And that expression stayed on and became very popular, not because this was kind of a way of welcoming and accepting the British scholarship per se, but largely because from the 70s and 80s onward, the whole process of how the properties like land and housing have become increasingly commodified and becoming financial asset, and becoming one of the major drivers of urban changes, not only in advanced economies like the UK, the US, and Western Europe, but increasingly across the entire world, and therefore emerging economies, developing countries, were also increasingly seeing the heightening importance of the real estate industries. Cities increasingly changing to accommodate new real estate in order to reap the benefits of such industry and make profits. So this becoming increasingly one of the main drivers of changes, and therefore people coming to, and scholars across the world increasingly coming to understand more critically this urban change driven by such a real estate led kind of development, and therefore thinking about gentrification more widely. And it has a social and economic effect because the process known as gentrification is causing rising property values, shifts in social makeup of neighborhoods, and often the displacement of existing communities. And that's why, as I was kind of opening at the beginning, it does really include very critical perspectives about the changes. It's largely, it was emerging because people were unhappy about the process. Scholars were finding this process being problematic, and therefore increasingly approaching this issue using the concept of gentrification to really understand why and how this was happening and what sort of impact were being produced upon those people who are being displaced. Having said that, one thing also maybe we can think about is because of this process being very unequal, and as I said, not everyone is going to be is losing out from this. There are many who are gaining and benefiting from this. So I take one example of in Seoul some years ago when I was having this conversation with some colleagues about gentrification, and this was in a small kind of gallery kind of space where there was a bit of exhibition about the negative consequences of in a process of gentrification. And there was someone who walked in and standing next to us and listening, and he turned out to be a lawyer actually, but asking, there must be good gentrification. All these neighborhood changes, and with the becoming cities becoming more affluent, and new houses being erected, and new taste and new cultural kind of scenes, which are benefiting many who are keen to have access to those. So these are emerging in places where they didn't really have any of these. So fancy cafes, galleries, more cultural kind of experiences, diversifications. And he was kind of referring to those as a way of asking, and then asking, gentrification can be good for some people. Why do you have to always criticize it? So that's basically the very essence of why this conversation about gentrification is going to be quite difficult. These changes are going to be quite welcoming for some, but can be also very unwelcoming and very difficult for others. And therefore, whenever this conversation about gentrification pops up, there is going to be a bit of division already in the room, quite naturally, because of the way people relate themselves to whatever changes that they observe in cities. And as I said, because of the whole contemporary processes of global capitalism, there was increasingly seeing the importance of real estate industries and real estate finance and how the properties were turning increasingly into commodities. And therefore, individual homes are no longer seen as the site of livelihood and homes or use value. Increase becoming basically this turning into exchange value that can be part of the market transactions. And that process increasingly driving people towards more accumulation based on property investment. And this is basically producing gentrification to go sort of global, right? And this is where I was kind of with a couple of other colleagues of mine who are writing this book, Planetary Gentrification, to really think about how this whole a transformation of contemporary capitalism, especially referring to the real estate and property development being one of the main drivers, having become basically a planetary process. And this is basically again referring to real estate investment being the driver of changes. But at the same time, when you think of this, there's a need of very localized way of thinking. Why this is happening in this very place, in a given country, in a given city, trying to understand. Especially when you think about in a process of gentrification in any given city, given neighborhood. On the one hand, you can think about the whole more universal process of capitalism. On the other hand, you also need to think about how this capitalism and capitalist process of urban spatial production has been localized, right? What sort of histories do you need to take into consideration? What has been the perception of property, perception of property right, perception of individual right has come to be in any given place, and using that as a way of thinking how the whole emergence of the new forms of capitalistic kind of accumulation have been entwining and interacting with the local processes of place making and individual perception being developed, and thinking of what that actually means for really critically engaging with this process of gentrification and displacement. This is probably a good summary of working definition that I was using with my colleagues in this book on planetary gentrification. Referring to these three specific elements. One is the commodification of urban space. As I said, real estate development becoming a very important driver, and that produces a lot of these desires to really pursue changes that result in displacement of local people, and that requires the properties being turned into commodities, right? And that commodification of urban space really becoming one of the key drivers, and therefore part of the definitional discussions. And then, in my case, I would really emphasize the need of thinking about displacement at the very core of gentrification thinking. And this is where I come back to a little later towards before the end of today's lecture, what it means to think of displacement. And if I preempt you, displacement is not just about direct physical displacement. There can be a more nuanced way of thinking about displacement. And then the process also involving social upgrading of neighborhoods and transformation of community dynamics and identity. And this is where the neighborhood itself changing, rather than kind of pursuing kind of mixed identities and diversification. You kind of turning a neighborhood into something that is fairly new and alien to that place, and therefore why this process can be seen to be problematic, right? If it was more kind of more affluent people coming in, living side by side through densification with people who used to live there, where local residents are still remaining and they can actually become the host of the changes, then perhaps we wouldn't have this problem, right? But because the local people are no longer being the host of changes, no longer being the owners of the change, and this is where the problems emerge, right? And the identities of the place are changing, becoming they are being problematic largely, not because these new identities are something we don't want to see happening, but because the new identities are something that is really replacing the previous identities, and the previous people who retain these identities are being driven away and no longer being part of the process, right? So I think I probably skipped this, given that I mentioned quite a bit of this already. And one of the interesting, probably conceptual discussions that can be part of gentrification in a debate is this idea of rent gap. And this is largely because of the importance of thinking about real estate industries and how the real estate industries are increasingly turning into these properties, into commodities, and that comes with a lot of drivers to either produce and sell to gain more profit, or produce and rent in order to gain more rental income. Whatever that form, avenue of profiteering can be. One thing you can really consider usefully and productively is this idea of rent gap, basically referring to the ground rent, the actual ground rent based on the current use of the land. And then what can be expected if the land is put into, in a developer's jargon, higher and better use. So the higher and better use can be achieved by either basically new buildings with greater amenities and facilities, more modern facilities coming in. The land experiencing greater upgrading by means of new infrastructure, right? The sewage system being improved, or the location itself presenting greater potential, right? The land itself may stay still, it's not moving, or maybe surrounding areas are increasingly going through changes, and therefore, by being in the location, you're basically seeing greater potential, and therefore, greater potential to reap the higher rent. So that kind of the gap between what is the current rent based on the current use, and what is the expected rent based on the future use. If the gap is sufficiently large enough, then the more likely that new development is going to kick in, right? So developers know this, and they do this, and they use it as a great strategy, and they go around and they identify the places that has great potential, right? Now, what this actually tells us is, well, if that gap is sufficiently large, the change is not going to happen automatically. And that's the whole idea about this rent gap, which for some people can be a way of economic thinking. But what this actually tells us in the more critical geography literature and critical urban studies literature is really about how the whole process of neighborhood change and building on this rent gap idea, or the difference between the current use and the potential that it can be generated. It's basically somebody has to do something. Developers have to do something to make this happen. Governments have to do something to make this happen. And this basic idea of rent gap is really about thinking about the politics. Somebody has to take action to realize this, and this action is not pre-given. Right? This also means even if a place has a great potential to be gentrified, and therefore you are a little concerned, there's also potential to prevent it from happening. Right? The only question is how strong can you intervene? How can you mobilize yourself to be able to challenge the power of developers, right, who have a lot of resources and experience to some extent. And that's not quite easy, right? And therefore, there's always the need of thinking about the broader, kind of a coalition or alliance or network, whatever you name it, in order to make sure you have the same type of, or at least the comparable type of, and the scale of expertise and resources, right? So when you kind of look at the examples across the world, it's often the case that residents are usually unable to challenge developers because they lack the experience, they lack often the knowledge, especially the legal knowledge about the planning knowledge, and they don't know quite how the planning actually works, what the procedural issues are, and so on. So they need the aid and support of lawyers. They need the support of planners who had the experience, who know the process, who know what the paperwork is to be going to be like, and so on and so forth. And that also means you need people who are these kind of intellectuals and practitioners who may feel sympathetic towards the cause of a resident and working together to support them. Only then you can start thinking about how to move forward to really do something about the changes which are seemingly imminent in the neighborhood. And also, while thinking about the rent gap and the whole gentrification, what is also interesting in Asian context is the whole idea of change is not quite the same as the idea of change in Western, more mature cities of the West. So I guess the same probably applies here in Malaysia as well as in South Korea or China. When you think about change, change is not something people are hegitating. I mean, I think people are welcoming changes because that's how Asian economies have been developing. In South Korea or China, when you speak to people, if something remains unchanged for some time, it seems to be, oh, that's not quite right. If an infrastructure goes is decaying and undermaintained, people will be very frustrated. They'll be criticizing the government, local government in particular. Why are you not doing anything to upgrade this, right? And they want to see the change relatively quickly. So I think this is an interesting aspect about the Asian context of gentrification, where the neighborhood change is also quite rapid. It changes quite quickly, not the same kind of time scale as you may see in Western economies, which also takes us to really question what it means to make the intervention. So because these changes are quite quick, on the one hand, developers who are going to pursue the change, they really take all the resources that they have in order to facilitate the change. If it takes the law to really start the whole process of demolition and enable change within 20, 30, 50 years' time, they may try to lobby the government to reduce the law, to change the law, to make it maybe 20 years. And that has happened in Singapore, for example, in South Korea as well. Right? Or to change the law about the consent rate. In Singapore, it used to be like 100% consent rate to pursue the redevelopment. And they thought this was too high. And they brought it down to 90%, 80% in order to facilitate this, right? So these are all being part of the process to make things happen as quickly as possible. And that also means, the sooner a change takes place, the more difficult for residents to intervene as well, because it takes more time to organize communities, and communities need time to understand the process, and need time to mobilize, need time to find supporters, and they basically, time is of essence, and very often time is not their friend, in this case, for residents. And therefore, you also face a very difficult situation in Asian context where the scale of change is quite big. It's not simply dwelling by dwelling upgrading. It's more about neighbor scale change where the entire neighborhood is subject to demolition and redevelopment. And that's pretty often what the government is trying to pursue. And therefore, you are really having a much more problematic situation and a lot more challenging than you may find elsewhere in the West. And this is just for those who are more into academic literature. One useful quote from the very person who was thinking about the rent gap, Neil Smith. I should also say, probably given that there are many, probably I would assume, undergraduate students in the room, Neil Smith, who was one of the key scholars who were really prominent, was really prominent in this literature on gentrification. The whole idea of rent gap and his own thesis about the political economic drivers of gentrification was based on his undergraduate thesis, which became very popular. And this undergraduate thesis, when he wrote this and he sent it to someone, again, some of you may be familiar with the name David Harvey, and asking, oh, I've got this paper, I want to publish this, and do you think it has potential? And David Harvey was like, I mean, this is so plain, everyone knows about this, and didn't really say an encouraging word. And Neil Smith just went ahead and published this in the Journal of the American Planning Association, I think, and then it became one of the most widely cited paper, a landmark paper. So if you have an undergraduate thesis that project you are working on, be ambitious. So as I said, politics matter us, and it matters a lot in the conversation about gentrification for the reasons I was saying, which I wouldn't repeat. So political power shapes whether economic opportunities for gentrification are realized. And here, of course, political power is not just about the national politicians or local politicians. The political power of it can also be the political power of local communities as well. Government, developers, and communities have varying influences in redevelopment decisions, impacting urban neighborhoods, and therefore, it's also equally important, for them, especially for communities, to really find the space and time to really build up this knowledge, and also to get the support of others who has the knowledge. And it's important for community advocacy and resistance, especially if they feel the change is something they are not welcoming, and therefore they may need to organize themselves. It's always better to fight together rather than one family or individual challenging the big corporation and so on. And it requires empowerment and participation among these people, especially who are being subject to displacement. And one of the kind of interesting kind of ideas to consider is also the whole process of dispossession, and especially here dispossession of people's rights, which are often part of the process of gentrification. So when land and housing become commodified, it also means they are being subject to market transaction. But that process of converting these land and housing properties into commodities, again, doesn't happen naturally, doesn't happen in a market process. It happens because there's a changes pursued by by the laws, the changes pursued by developers, changes pursued by government, and so on. So, and that process does involve very often the whole dispossession of people's right to influence changes. The dispossession of people's rights to keep the ownership of the properties that they used to own. And this is why I was kind of referring to this idea of the dispossession of people's rights often acting as a precursor to gentrification in order to basically convert those properties into commodities that can be now part of that process of real estate speculation and displacement. And this is probably where I would also ask you to think about what it means to talk this displacement issue. So up until now, you may probably think about displacement as basically the direct physical displacement. So if I kind of if you kind of assume this whole lecture theater being a neighborhood, some of you being basically driven away and moving out of lecture theater, that's direct physical displacement, right? But very often, the whole idea of displacement comes with more nuanced way of thinking about the whole process. So some useful concept that you can consider is change displacement, which basically requires us to think of longer term process of how neighborhood change is taking place, so that not only the very people who are being subject to removal at the time of demolition, not only these are the ones who are being displaced, but there are many who are living and who are seeing the changes coming, and therefore they feel like, oh, I don't want to stay until the very time of this demolition and redevelopment. I don't like the inconvenience, and therefore they feel the displacement pressure, and they move out long before the actual change itself takes place. And these people are not usually captured by any statistics. So when you read about any change and say, oh, there's a redevelopment of a project in the neighborhood, this is going to affect, this is going to result in X number of families being evicted. But there are many others potentially who used to live there, but who may be basically moving out, largely because they feel the pressure to move, and therefore these people are not really captured in the number that you come across. And this is important given that a process of redevelopment is a very long process. It's not like you go into a shop and buy an iPhone within an hour or days, and it takes place across many years because it requires a lot of planning procedures and so on and so forth, and that can be quite time consuming, and there's a lot of market influences as well, and a neighbor can easily be subject to this development pressure and for 5, 10, 20 years. This is very much often the case in China and South Korea even. When I was studying the gentrification as part of my doctoral thesis, this was many years ago, but the average number of years that a neighborhood was subject to such a redevelopment and pressure was like 20 years. Right? So people kind of look at this and kind of feel the pressure, and therefore many people, when the pressure feels more imminent and more real, they kind of ooh, I don't want to live here. If you're a tenant, I'd rather rent somewhere else and do not feel the pressure of change. So change displacement can be quite an important, interesting concept to think about. How the actual scale of displacement can be much larger than you may actually observe at the last minute of change. Exclusionary development displacement is referring to how a neighborhood change can actually produces the much less kind of the reduction of affordable stocks for people who may be having in need of such stocks. So a neighborhood that is more affordable for low-income people, if there was providing homes for 1,000 families, now the neighborhood changing into middle-class neighborhood. If a city doesn't provide equal number of new affordable housing for low-income people elsewhere or in the same place, basically you're taking 1,000 homes out of the stocks for affordable low-income people in a city, right? And basically you are reducing the stock of affordable homes for low-income people. And when this change takes place in a larger scale, within a short period of time, which is what happened in South Korea in the 1980s and 1990s, where a lot of commercial redevelopment projects were demolishing and reconstructing low-income neighborhoods, many of whom used to be squatter settlements. It basically suddenly reduced hundred of thousands of homes in a relatively short period of time, within a few years' time, which basically created this situation in which low-income people didn't really have places to go to, and therefore they were kind of flowing into, moving into existing neighborhoods, which used to provide affordable homes, and that basically pushed the rental prices up, and therefore you're basically the whole idea of redeveloping low-income neighborhood is basically producing two interesting outcomes. On the one hand, you are reducing the number of stocks available to low-income people, and at the same time, if you are not actually producing new homes for low-income people elsewhere in the same scale, you are basically creating the usual demand-supply mismatch of you have a continued demand for low-income affordable homes for those families, but the supply has been substantially reduced, and therefore basically you are creating a situation where rents are increasing for low-income tenants, even though nothing has been changing for their economic status. It's also a long-term effect on people. Once you are being displaced, when you are moving away from the neighborhood where you used to live for many years, where you used to have raise your family, where you used to have a network of people, by being displaced, you basically means you are being uprooted. You are losing the network. You don't maintain the network in the same way. In South Korea, again, the same goes to China. Neighborhood before redevelopment used to be quite horizontal, quite flat. One-story dwellings, two-story dwellings, and the network was through kind of street networks and a very horizontal network of people, which are being replaced by the high-rise condominiums of 20 stories or 30 stories. It started with 12 or 15 stories in the 1980s and increasingly becoming much higher over the years. And there's already a report by saying, when people move into high-rises, the kind of network they used to maintain horizontally no longer is being maintained. People lose contact. Even if they live in the same building, the very fact that they have to basically move up and down in a neighborhood basically it makes it difficult for them to retain the same kind of relationship, the same kind of contact hours between themselves. When compared with what they used to have in a more horizontal setting. So it has a long-term effect on the chances of on the life chances. And this is another interesting aspect, kind of one final point to talk about displacement. And I'm aware I'm already reached like 40 minutes, so I really have to stop now to keep my promise. So 2 points to raise. One is this issue. Displacement is really not only about direct physical displacement. You can also think about how especially in a neighborhood change, the urban spatial change comes with this process of unhoming, where people feel no longer home in a neighborhood that they still continue to live, largely because all the surrounding characteristics have changed substantially beyond the recognition, to a point where they feel no longer home and comfortable, right? So even if you are staying put and you are still keeping your house, if all surrounding in a neighborhood have changed and then you don't really relate to them anymore, or the neighbors have changed and therefore you don't know people anymore, you have to start a new relationship. And we all know how some of us actually, at least, over the years of your life, it's increasingly becoming more difficult to make new friends. Making friends in university, that's fine. I mean, you can do that. Making friends in your 30s, 40s, not easy. Making friends in your 60s and 70s, probably more difficult, right? And therefore, the whole changes that people go through, even if you stay put and you feel you are still protected by your own home, if everything else changes, the kind of grocery stores they used to go to, the kind of people they used to speak to, no longer there. It's basically the same as you basically living in completely new space, new place, right? So that's basically referring to this in-place displacement. it also has policy implication as well. So when policymakers or planners think about, well, we want to protect the people to stay put, but they still have to think about how the very act of staying put really has to involve some sort of some sense of belonging, even after the changes have taken place. If they kind of come back and live, but they don't feel like they are in the same neighborhood, everything has changed, then it's becoming problematic, right? And last thing to think about displacement is the temporality. So and this is basically trying to identify, sum up what I was saying earlier. We need to really think about when does the displacement actually start and when does it actually finish. The short answer is it starts much sooner than the very moment of leaving your house or leaving your neighborhood. It also doesn't finish at the time of leaving your house. It has a much longer term impact on your livelihood, and therefore the effect of displacement lingers and continues to influence you. And as I said earlier, just to summarize, it's a political project. The whole framing of redevelopment is very important. How you frame it, using what language, is going to be very important, and is going to determine how it's going to turn out, how the outcome is going to turn out. And that framing also influences the extent to which local people can participate and voice out as well. Gentrification often reshapes cities for elite consumption, reinforcing social and economic inequalities. And it does need critical examination, therefore, to question redevelopment beneficiaries and critically analyze policy narratives around gentrification. It's not necessary to criticize redevelopment itself, right? It's not necessary. It's not to criticize change itself. It's more about how the change and development can be more beneficial for the larger communities, and how people can actually have a say and can participate in the change, so that they have a sense of belonging, a sense of ownership. And this is also, as I said earlier, this large-scale development in Asia makes it even more challenging, and why this talk about politics is becoming even more important. And as a way of concluding, studying gentrification can be important because it really is asking us to think about the urban inequality, how the process of urban change reveals how capital state power and social forces shape urban inequality and change. It also entails thinking about how to amplify the community voices who are being affected by this change. It also requires us to also think about, well, if community voices are to be amplified, how that amplification can be organized and mobilized. And it does require this collaborative knowledge building. And I love the university's, I think it's known to be the garden of knowledge and virtue. And I guess this is where the collaborative knowledge building to really make it, make sure these alliances that bring together people who may not have the who may not yet have the expertise, but who have the experience, who has the knowledge of their neighborhood, their history, can really work more broadly with other people who have the expertise of planning, law, and so on, and to really come together to think about how the changes can be more beneficial for them, rather than resisting the change itself, and make sure that works for their own future as well. So I just remind people of the last point. Reclaiming the city requires ongoing commitment from communities, policymakers, and scholars for equitable urban futures. And this is probably where we come together to really think what it means to really collaborate, what it means to really work together on what terms, and how to ensure we give a space to everyone who is willing to have a say in the whole process. And thank you very much. This is where I kind of conclude with this final, going back to what I was saying about the whole city as a collective action. A nice quote I always enjoy sharing is this one, coming from the scholar Margaret Cohn.
in a book, The Descent Life of the Urban in Commonwealth, where she says, the city is often figured as a commodity, but it is to be treated as a commons and a public good. It is the materialization of value that was created collectively by past generations who built the city and diverse contemporaries who repair and animate it. And therefore, I think that idea is probably going to be something we can always consider when thinking about what it means to really have a sense of ownership of change. And when you see a new cafe, new bookstore coming to your neighborhood, this is often seen to be like the bridgehead of gentrification, because that is seen to be attracting tourists and middle classes and so on. But if the cafe and bookshop can be a place for mobilizing local people, where they welcome local residents to come and have a meeting, and try integrating the neighborhood, why not? It's always nice to have some new places to go to and new places to really meet, and as well as keeping the old places. So I think that's probably where I would kind of urge us to think about what it means to really consider change, how to respond to it, and how to also make the change works for us and for our better future. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Hyun, for the inspiring and insightful public lecture. Next, we would like to invite our moderator, Dr. Nur Fariza Mustafa, to kindly take over the floor for the next session, a fireside conversation between Prof. Hyun Shin and Dr. Nur Fariza Mustafa. With all due respect, we invited Prof. Hyun Shin and Dr. Fariza Mustafa to the stage to continue with today's session. Dr. Nur Fariza, the floor is now yours.
Hi, thank you, our MC for the day. Welcome everyone. I'm Fariza. Happy to be here to talk to Prof. Hyun about his brilliant lecture that we've just heard. I think what strikes me the most was really how you started the conversation really with framing these issues as issues of contestations of power, particularly in the urban context. And I think that hardly gets highlighted when we talk about urban change, but if we're not talking in a scholarly context, right? People only think about the power asymmetries or the struggles in getting their agenda forward when they are negatively affected by development. But in effect, every change in our urban fabric is being driven by the active pursuit of these agendas by people who can control them. And I think that's that's a very useful frame to think about these sort of processes, urbanization, development, as well as the effects of urbanization and development, gentrification and displacement that we've talked about today, in a context where the state may play a powerful role in driving these changes, both as the architect of development as well as the facilitators, right? And in societies, I mean, Malaysia included, I mean, probably more so in Asian societies where states may take on a stronger role in driving these changes. Those asymmetries in power in effectively acknowledging that there are people who actively pursue this kind of agendas in urban setting may not be as obvious because in societies where states are, well, a strong player in driving the development agenda, those asymmetries can be taken as something that's, that's a norm, rather than something that can be challenged. And I think if I may bring the conversation on our topic today, gentrification and displacement, back to the Malaysian context, I would really like to get your views. I mean, I think we'll have this fireside conversation. We'll start with maybe a few questions that I'll pose, and then we'll open the floor for everyone here to give their comments or share their experiences with these types of processes and with these types of of experiences. And if I may start by bringing it back to the Malaysian experience, back in the early 2000s and late 1990s, KL, Kuala Lumpur, the city that we're in currently itself, has actually pursued a zero squatters policy. And what that entailed was that what we did at the time was the city decided that squatter houses, which had effectively been the de facto housing choice or housing option for a lot of people who migrated into the cities in the 70s, 80s, 90s, squatter houses were effectively no longer a desirable component of the city. So what we've decided as a city and what the city did back during the day was they decided to build these new flats, low-cost flats, our PPRs or PRRs that we call them today, which now are part of our social housing sector. And they effectively move squatter populations into these flats. And the land on which squatter homes were built or were already existing were then used for other development purposes. So I think in talking about the issue of gentrification and displacement, inherently it carries with it the need to discuss how legalities affects the process. How this should transpire is quite clear when we consider maybe those who actually own their property in the cities, those who have rights over property. Because to my mind, if development were to occur or were pushed onto property owners, they would essentially, those who have legal rights over their properties can claim compensation. They can be, hopefully even be part of the negotiating process of how this development happens in their localities. And at the very least, they would have a slight position of bargaining to determine how it might look like for them going through the process. But as you may be aware, tenure arrangements, landholding arrangements in Malaysia, in a lot of the global south, Malaysia, Indonesia particularly, are not, cannot be, it doesn't fit neatly into sort of dichotomy of legal versus illegal or formal versus informal. There's a lot more diversity in terms of what tenure arrangements actually exist, and what rights to your house or your property actually means. For example, in Malaysia itself, we have what we call temporary occupation license, and these can be given to households in kampong areas or even more informal houses in the city. So when we think about these kind of issues, what about those populations or those residents who actually reside outside of the legal framework? People or populations who may be what we would term to be in the extra legal or in the non-legal parts of the framework that we are talking about. For example, the squatters that I mentioned, informal settlements, or even indigenous members of the indigenous communities who often may not be as well protected or as well considered in our policy framework. What are your thoughts on how we should think about the considerations that need to be in place for communities such as this when developments are forced upon them or need to be undertaken in their places of residence?
Well, thank you for a very, very Interesting question. It's and also probably a difficult question. Because what you're saying and raising is a big issue, something that cannot be probably resolved in a clear-cut way. And also, I would probably also start by saying, I'm probably not the best person to advise what's to happen in Malaysia. You are probably more expert than I am about that. What I can probably share will be probably more broader sense of kind of perspectives or approaches. So a number of thoughts come to my mind, and I say, first of all, so there's always kind of issue of who is to be counted and who is not to be counted. So there's always this kind of act of when it comes to I mean, for any governmental procedures and planning processes, and something has to be done to understand the scale and the counting the people and who is eligible, who is not eligible based on the acceptable notions of property rights and so on. So that's often part of the governing strategies and governing techniques. And some of you who have studied sociology and so on will understand the whole, the setting up and establishment of modern nation state comes with the whole, advance of the governing technologies to make sure the populations are legible and so on. So that also feeds into the whole process of neighborhood change and redevelopment as well. From government point of view, they want to be able to understand who is there and who is eligible for what they are pursuing. And this is always going to also involve in a certain definition of what it means to own a property. And as we say, rightly so, this whole kind of a compilation of legality and illegality, no clear-cut division between the two. A house can easily be both legal and illegal, right? And that's always the case. There's nothing, almost always, not, very often, there are many houses which are seemingly legal, but which also come with a lot of illegal additions, extensions. That's always quite common. And also, what was initially illegal, due to the long occupation, is known, is kind of accepted illegality based on what they were paying as part of utility bills over a long period of time, and even if they were occupying public land, they were staying there for minimum X number of years, then they are known to be kind of they are often accepted as having the right to claim the ownership if no other challenge has been made to them. So there are a lot of these situations in which the clear-cut division cannot be possible, which also means the boundary is always moving. Right? So this is probably coming back to how to define the boundary, how to define the line to draw what's acceptable and what is not acceptable. And this is basically coming down to what sort of consensus a society is going to produce about this. So I don't think learning from say the Western economies can be useful in this regard. Learning from Western laws can be useful. I mean, law itself, it has a very has a historicity and is based on certain customs and understandings about what it means to talk about individual rights and so on. And therefore, you can't take that as granted. One thing I was also I've been thinking about is we often talk about social justice and injustice. For a lot of this kind of Western notion of social justice is based on a Western notion of liberalism. And so the other day I was having a conversation with a colleague who was from the US and who is really into studies of social justice. Many of these discussions I also respect and engage. But the whole idea of social justice in the West is basically building on this liberalistic notion of what rights mean and what justice means. which may not always be easily understood in the same way in Asia. And therefore, all of these discussions about what is to be considered as acceptable right and permissible right and recognized right, and recognized and how those recognition can feed into the whole discussion about legality and illegality should also involve more society-wide kind of conversations within each country, within each locality, to really define their own rules of the game. So I would probably just defer. Yes, it's not easy, but I think in Malaysia, we also, as you were referring to, the whole particularities of Malaysia will require the people to really think about, well, let's at least recognize this within our country context and use that as the base of thinking about the next round of whether compensation is to be in a total, whether monetary compensation or in-kind compensation, whatever that is. One thing I would probably just add is when we often talk about compensation in monetary terms, and that's precisely the language of capitalism. Right? And therefore, you also need to think about when you are thinking of compensation, what are you compensating? And very often, developers want this to be basically straightforward monetary based on the value. So they do all the valuation of properties and so on, which may not take other non-monetary aspects of livelihood into consideration. And this is basically going back to the framing, the development, redevelopment, or the language, the discourse becoming very important. What languages do you introduce and think about this? And do we replicate and use the language of developers? Or do we use the language that actually speaks for local communities? And how those can be recognized and accepted in policy circles so that government officials who are meant to be representing the whole nation and communities, not only representing developers, can also take the language into consideration so that the whole framing of redevelopment from governmental perspective also doesn't simply replicate the language of developers. So that's probably where I would say as a starting point. And law, I'm a, I would say in most cases, I'm a law-abiding citizen and so on. But law itself is not, it's also changing. I think we need to be also mindful of the fact that law is not pre-given and it doesn't change. Law has been changing over many years, and everyone here in the room has the capacity to change the law or to influence the change of the law. And that's how law has been evolving over time in every country. When you look at South Korea and even China's experience, and those two countries are very different in terms of political organization, tradition, and history. South Korea is known to be more like Western economy, where the electoral democracy is more prevailing nowadays. But it wasn't like that from the beginning. South Korea is also known to be more in Western sense, more democratized than China. But then it wasn't also like that from the beginning. In South Korea, squatter settlement was subject to a lot of demolition and redevelopment in the 80s, and many squatters who used to live there for 10, 20 plus years were also subject to demolition, eviction with very little compensation or small compensation. But they were also mobilizing throughout the 1980s and 1990s. One of my papers about the genealogy of urban rights was looking at how this discourse of rights has been changing in line with the way squatters and evictees were mobilizing themselves over the years, working more broadly with other societal actors to voice out. And these were feeding into governmental pursuit of new planning laws and new policies. And therefore, they were also reshaping the way redevelopment was being framed. More recently, in 10 years ago, 15 years ago, there was a huge tragic incident of commercial tenants being subject to forceful eviction attempt, which led to the deaths of 6 tenants and 1 policeman, which was a very tragic incident that actually led to greater awareness of what it means to protect the right of commercial tenants, and that was leading to a subsequent pursuit of a reform of the law that was governing the tenant rights of commercial tenants, and leading to longer term protection. Where it used to be only up to 5 years, and I think, and then extended to 10 years for them to retain the right to stay in the premise without fearing the eviction by a landlord. And even in China in 2003-ish, because of many people who were protesting eviction from their homes, even suicidal kind of protest as well, government of China was also very concerned about this. And therefore, they were introducing, in response to such challenges by people, new law that was trying to make the whole process of eviction displacement a little more transparent. So even China, which is in comparison with South Korea and many others, people often refer to China to be more authoritarian and so on. But within China's context, the government still also has to listen to and respond to people, and that's also how the law has been changing as well. Not because politicians were all of a sudden coming to realization, oh, I have to really good and produce a good deed and change the law. They are pressured to change the law. So I think this is also where we need to think about what you say about legality, law, and so on and so forth, are all outcomes of these struggles and exchanges, and that's precisely why it's important to keep thinking about, talking about, and voicing out about these issues.
No, I think what you said about essentially rights that are legal versus rights that are recognized, I think that strikes that strikes me deeply, because I think that's something that struggle or that concentration is actually happening all the time, even if we don't realize it. And what can drive, or maybe what can drive more active participation in society is the realization that is a struggle that you have to take. If you want your right to be recognized, even if it's not legal, that has to come out. Like that conversation has to come out. That I think flows nicely to my next question, really, which is again, when we talk about legalities, we can't run away from talking about actual laws or actual legislations that are put in place essentially to shape or frame how development or redevelopment would look like in our cities. Malaysia currently is actually drafting its own Urban Redevelopment Act, which is still in the works. It might be, I think, tabled in our parliament either this year. That's what we've heard. But anyway, regardless of that point, it's quite obvious that policies are something that you can't just sort of plug and play, right? You can't take policy or you can't take a law from another country you shouldn't really. You can, but you shouldn't, in a sense, and just plug it into your own local context, because based solely on the experiences of other countries or some ideological or transplanted stance that you inherit, that kind of legal transplantation, I mean, we've seen how that doesn't really work, particularly in our in more non-Western contexts. We see that has brought even more problems. I mean, through the when we look at the pursuit of formalization or financialization of land and housing, that has actually created more problems rather than solutions. So we can't really assume that what works for, say, Singapore or Hong Kong or the UK would work for Malaysia. As we know, history matters, context matters, institutions matters. These things are the things that all speak to, and they shape the way the operating environment in which policies or laws will need to be implemented or will need to be practiced. But even so, nevertheless, in my mind, there should be some commonalities in what urban redevelopment laws or policies should aim to do, and thus those kind of principles should be implicit in the way that we design or we draft these kind of policies. And I'll use what you said before, yesterday, in fact, in our session, a bit in a slightly different context. That you said that states should work for society, and I think in this context, I think laws should work for society. Laws should be designed for the betterment of society. And I would love to hear what you think about what are the important sort of elements that need to be incorporated into laws that are meant to govern urban redevelopment. What are components that seem to work quite well to ensure that these development processes are equitable, that the gains from redevelopment are redistributed equitably to those who should benefit from them. Of course, how this gets sort of implemented or how this gets designed into our own policies will depend on the local context. But what would be the guiding principles in thinking about what laws that govern urban redevelopment should do?
Well, again, thank you for this very difficult question. Because each law that you may see in any given country is very highly contextualized, and you can't simply, as you say, you can put Urban Renewal Act in Singapore or Korea and just change the name of the country and say this is for Malaysia, right?
Yeah.
So you can't do that, and then you really have to really put that in a context within Malaysia. About which I really don't have the right expertise, so I wouldn't go into make any suggestions about you have to have this and that. Especially when it comes to detailed kind of discussion about the whole process and so on. But then I guess in terms of principle, I guess the one thing I can say is probably the first line of the law. What do you want to have in the first line of the law, right? The purpose of the law, right?
Yeah.
So you can either, you can easily put in the line number clause one, act the clause of one. In the same way, Constitution, like in South Korea, says. In South Korea, the Constitution basically the first one says South Korea is the democratic republic. Basically saying this is power to the people. No matter how the Constitution has been interpreted over the history, but at least that's how people actually say, especially when it comes to huge demonstrations like the one we used to have. The most recent one was leading to the presidential impeachment a few years ago, and this is why I feel always kind of happy about my own country. We don't just kill president. If president do something bad, we put them in jail. But that was when people were basically saying, on the street, the number one in South Korea is a democratic republic. But that actually has a very powerful implication on how people see themselves and mobilize on the street. But that was also the result of the 1980s democratization, which led to the constitutional revision. Right? So, in thinking about this, Urban Renewal Act should probably also involve thinking about what do we put in the first line. Is the Urban Renewal Act aiming at the efficient land use? If you start with that, then basically the rest of the act is going to have to address how to make the land use efficient. Right? In order to make the land use efficient, you need to think about where the land use is not efficient. And very often, efficiency is the language of capitalism again, right? So then everything will follow along the line. But if the first line is really say the law is to address the betterment of society, then you start thinking of what it means to actually make this society better, right? Then the rest of discussions, whether people agree or not, we still have to really argue and discuss whose life is to be better, to what extent, what sort of compromise to be made, and that's already a very productive start of discussion.
It's always better than to have those discussions rather than not having the discussion at all. And that's that kind of discussion in a argument about where to draw the boundary and so on is already a very healthy indication of a good indication of healthy society to have having that debate. Right? As LSE is always emphasized when new students come in, what we want to promote, and I think Tiba, one of our LSE alumni here, will know this. One thing we always highlight is because people come, LSE has all these students who are coming from like 160 different countries, coming from all different religious background, different political background, ethical background, and so on and so forth. We acknowledge that diversity, and therefore, as I was saying earlier in the induction meeting, another thing I say in addition to we are here to inconvenience you and make you uncomfortable, is we are here to also make sure it's important to understand what it means to disagree, what it means to agree to disagree in an amicable way, without getting into any physical fights, any fist fights. So I think this, as long as we retain the idea that we have the arguments, we may disagree, we may agree to disagree, but we are not going to aim guns to each other, right? So I think that's and on that basis, having the healthy debate about these issues is important, and that debate is going to be framed by what you are going to actually put as the aim of the act at the very top. So I think this is probably where I would probably say, where I guess the rest of the kind of technical procedure methods will be changing over time. You have to start from somewhere, and it'll be great to start from somewhere that can be more acceptable and make it easy for those who are concerned about this. So that's also important. But wherever you start, it's going to change over the years. But the very purpose of the act is more difficult to change. And therefore, probably think about what are we going to actually put in the line number 1 as the main, which is going to be really defining the purpose of the act. And then the rest will really follow in that direction.
I think that's a very useful way to think about it, just in terms of setting or anchoring the act in the actual goal rather than using more capitalistic language to enhance the effective use of land, as you've said, which is really a developer's way to actively push the agenda forward. So I'd like it's a So I think it's good to now open the floor for comments and maybe questions from our participants. I see a lot of friends in the audience. If you could just raise your hand if you have a question, and our staff.
Hi, thank you, Doctor, for your sharing. So I have one question. Do you agree that gentrification is just a symptom of uneven development between rural and urban areas? And if we invested equitably across all regions, people won't be forced to crowd into cities. So this leads to my next question. How does age play into gentrification? Because I think if there is a pattern in the age demographic, then perhaps there is something that is distributed unevenly that is important for a particular age group, if my question makes sense to you.
Particular age group.
Yeah.
You want to collect a couple more, or just to respond to this one directly?
We can collect three questions and then go over that if there are anyone else.
Thank you, Prof, for your very inspiring session. My name is Rahmat Bayudi with Malaysia Urban Design Association. I'd like to probably note your reference to gentrification as a form of euphemism for displacement. I think that gives some hope for me looking at this whole perspective. Maybe you can, my first question would be, if you can expound a bit more on your commodification of gentrification as a form of commodification of urban space. I think that reflects the whole nature of how development now occurs. Perhaps expounding on that would be of value to us today. And my second question would be, what's your general advice, I suppose, to local authorities and local governments when embarking upon the physical plans, be it structure plan, local plans? What's the big picture here that needs to be always grounded when it comes to these contentions between gentrification and displacement? And maybe an example of, do we need rent control, for example? Yes, this is one view. And my third one is a bit more global. Maybe your view on the displacements of Gaza population via ethnic cleansing and genocide. How do you view that from a real estate perspective? And perhaps, how attractive is that as an investment for real estate? Just an overall overview. Thank you.
I think that's a lot of questions for you to address.
Again, those are really, really great questions, and again, very difficult questions, which I welcome, by the way. So, think about the first in a set of questions about rural, urban, and the age group. I think yes. I mean, the rural-urban unequal development does influence the process of gentrification in various ways. In a sense, I mean, the whole kind of urbanization drive, which happens not simply by, I mean, it happens mostly by concentration of population in existing urban areas, right? I think yesterday, if I remember correctly, I think Malaysia's urbanization rate like 75%, although the 75% of Malaysian population who are now deemed to be urban, living on like a 10% of the territory, was it? Yeah. So in a sense, you have a greater concentration of people in cities, right? For various regions, people migrate to cities. That's where probably people find the opportunities to make income, to find jobs for educational purposes, and so on and so forth. And that does basically produce more demand for urban space, more demand for housing, more demand for various other things that they deem to be appropriate. So that does really add more pressure on what you find in cities. If you can actually think of pursue more equitable development for rural areas for them to be able to retain, of course, then you are actually releasing the pressure on cities as well. The same probably goes to more regional uneven development. If you are having more people coming to KL, Selangor, and so on, then staying where they are, then of course gentrification is more likely to be more rampant in a city like KL. So the whole process of commodification of urban space and so on is not to suggest that it's all evenly spread out across the entire across geographies. The whole process is very uneven. So there are going to be more places which are more likely to be susceptible to the pressure of gentrification, more likely to be going through commodification than other places. And therefore, it's an uneven process, and this is where rural-urban inequality that already exists can, if they get exacerbated, there are going to be places, certain cities, and within cities, certain places that are going to be experiencing this more than others. Right? So this is where, as someone from geography department, this whole geographical scale thinking is very, very useful. Within KL, of course, we are not really looking at every part of KL is gentrifying. It's not. It's some places are more gentrified than others and more under pressure of gentrification than other places. And that's always evolving and changing. And that's why probably the whole commodification space is going to be important. Many places which used to be outside the purview of capitalist accumulation, increasingly being part of that, and that's part of basically the natural mechanism of capitalism. In the same way, capitalistic accumulation over the years and in history has been leading to imperialistic expansion, not because political ambition was there, but that's also basically part of the expansion of capitalism to constantly develop new opportunities to accumulate, and that's leading to this kind of imperial expansion. The same goes to contemporary globalization, which itself is basically in a whole expansion of capitalism to reach out to corners of the world which were not part of the accumulation process. And the same goes to urban spaces as well. So urban spaces, which used to be in communal ownership, for example, is being basically disintegrated and being becoming more codified and identified to be subject to market transaction. And there has been an experience in almost any country which has gone through this process of capitalistic development from non-capitalistic relations, where many traditional forms of kind of a rights or communal kind of claims being subject to this disintegration and erasure in order to make them more susceptible to capitalistic intervention, especially in this case, the properties, communal properties being subject to investment and therefore going through commodification, right? And I guess you are more likely than I am, to be able to identify, hey, that's really what happened in many parts of kampungs and so on and so forth. And therefore, this is where how much do you want to retain these? If they are deemed to be very important for social livelihood and community building and retention. And that's probably going leading to what you were saying about the recommendation to administrators or government and so on. I'm probably asking them, how much do you want to really serve the interest of these people, rather than, we all know it's important to create jobs. It's important to also pursue some degree of quantitative and economic development to create jobs and to increase the productivity or to increase the wages and so on and so forth. But while pursuing these, equally important to retain, the communities, make sure that they don't get completely disintegrated. I think everyone needs to have some sense of belonging. I mean, it's not like we are going to ask people to be all individualistic. There's various ways of grouping, and that sense of belonging is often very much linked to the whole sense of community, which inherits what used to exist in any given country economy. And I think that's where how much this pursuit of economic growth can be combined with the pursuit of community interest. One of the district mayors in South Korea, in Seoul, who is now bidding for the Seoul mayoralty, is known as like a Mr. Anti-gentrification. When he was running managing this district for 12 consecutive years. Yeah. But he was very. This is one of the places within Seoul that was really going through rampant gentrification, and he knew the detrimental outcome of this, and therefore, really thinking about how to ensure the livelihood can be improved, but while also ensuring the district can be popular for visitors, but also how to think about how this increasing popularity doesn't really lead to displacement of local people, local businesses. So constantly thinking about small and longer term, medium term, short term measures to make to somehow mitigate and alleviate the problems. So I think every politician will have the capacity, if they have the willingness to do so, and basically that's probably where I would recommend politicians to think more about. Age, I think, is an important issue, because all of these do have intergenerational differences and impact. I think it's all known. It's a known. I guess by now it's a known fact that across the world, there's an increasingly difficult situation as the affordability programs worsen, especially housing affordability. Younger generations, who are new to the market, increasingly feeling difficult to really, climb the housing ladder. It's already a known fact in the UK, where the number of mortgages being applied by younger people to buy a new home, especially in a city like London, basically has dropped sharply, because even though they can apply for mortgage, the mortgage they can take based on their current income is no longer sufficient, nowhere near the price of the house, and therefore it doesn't make sense to take the mortgage unless they have any other additional source of support coming from usually parents. But if your parents are not able to do that, then there's no way they can actually do that. And therefore, this whole, the reduction of mortgage application by young people becoming very apparent in more recent years. The same goes to South Korea. Nowadays, there's a whole generational despair, especially among the younger people, about where no matter how much I try, I'm not going to have a place in Seoul, or going to have a place to claim to be my own legally owned property. Now, that also has a bit of an additional issue, because Seoul is where people come to. That's known to be like the center of capital, center of power, center of culture, center of whatever you name it, and therefore people are willing to come to Seoul for whatever cost it entails, rather than staying in regional cities. So this with the same amount of money, they may easily be a homeowner in a regional city, but without really having a prospect of finding a good job or raising their family and so on. And therefore, they try to migrate to Seoul, where the same amount of money doesn't really guarantee any kind of small flat to be owned. So there's a dilemma. So this is again the whole rural-urban division, uneven development across the regions within a country, really create more pressure on young people. If young people are able to understand and realize, I don't really have to go to this big city. I can still stay here and still find a decent opportunity to develop my career and enjoy my life, then there's a good chance that they may consider, without jumping into just one option they find available. And that will already produce much more reduce the pressure on big cities, reduce the pressure on gentrification, and also a greater chance of the kind of intergenerational gaps and difficulties later generations may experience, which are real and there. I think this is also where I'm looking at many of these more seasoned colleagues here in the room. The greater responsibility for more seasoned in a segment of the population to take the responsibility to really think about how to provide opportunities for young people who really feel they don't see the same kind of opportunities than the previous generations. The last point, I'll probably just to say, is a lot of these are again not simply politically driven issue of genocide or ethnic cleansing. It's all also very much heavily entwined with economic rationales as well. And I think this is where the money to generate such atrocities. I think I don't know. One thing I always kind of find very difficult to understand is the whole talks about politics, about the whole political atrocities. Often do not often entail discussions about where's the money coming from. So in South Korea, you find this in whole nowadays there are many protests, not only by those who are on the left, those who are on the far right as well, and they often, especially during the time of presidential kind of impeachment period, where there are a lot of protests from both sides, in support of and against the president and so on. And those who are supporting the president also coming out with the American flags and Israeli flags at the same time. I was like, why Israeli flags? next to American flags, and I just couldn't understand American flags and next to Korean flags. That I can understand, for Korea's own historical kind of past. But sometimes you see Israeli flags as well. I was like, and then I kind of wonder who's buying these flags. It's not like individual protester waving this flag. They are out of their own pocket money. All of a sudden going to marketplace and buying a flag and coming out to the street, right? Somebody's supplying the flag. Somebody's supplying the American flags, right? And they must have some sort of financing. I always kind of wonder, what the source is. And this is probably where, that's probably a small example. But when you kind of expand this to the scale of a global industry and so on, there's a whole big issue, right? And this is where we often see a lot of invisible acts of lobbying, big powers, which are really hidden away from media scrutiny, really behind the games. Those are probably something we probably need to look more. Nobody's aiming guns at someone out of their own pocket money by building up their own business. Right? They are being supplied, and I think that suppliers are the biggest culprits.
I think that's brilliant. I think the critical question that we must ask when these urban processes actually happen is who actually truly benefits from them, where both the tangible and intangible gains from these developments or these changes in our urban fabric, who truly benefits? Is it, and who controls, who gets those benefits? I mean, I think that's a really critical position to explore. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Two. Okay, two more questions. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Ishaq Arifin. I'm a private town planning consultant. I find your comment just now about the law is very interesting. It's the first line of the act is very important. And because we were talking about Urban Renewal Act, the problem was the Urban Renewal Act that we tried to introduce is because I think when I look back at the first line, it says the purpose of the act is only to control and regulate urban renewal for the purpose of town planning and related matters. So it does not address why it wants to do urban renewal. So that's maybe your comment on that. As another two comments is, I think I would like to get your views, is because you gave examples of the gentrification, which is, I think, that's commonly seen in other places. But there's one case of gentrification in Kuala Lumpur that has happened is induced by the government, because the government had these quarters, about 100 units of houses that's been rented out to civil servant, but then it was sold to a private developer to build service apartment, and the civil servant had to move out from the city center. So this is one form of gentrification that has not been addressed. And then the last one is I just want to get your views on gentrification in heritage zone. In the this happens in, I think what's happening now in Georgetown and Malacca is very much contented. So some people are for and some people are against it. Okay, thank you.
Just one more.
Good afternoon. My name is Han. I'm from KRRA Plus. We are a coalition of over 80 resident associations in Kuala Lumpur. My first question is an extension of the earlier question asked by this gentleman to my left. In regards to the example that you cited, right, on the first sentence of any redevelopment act will define the nature of the law that will be outlined, right? Can you cite some examples where urban renewal, urban redevelopment act, right, starts with that sort of like a above a commercial objective. And because as we all know, right, local governments or even state governments, right, the prime source of revenue comes from giving out development approvals. So that's already essentially a divergent objective. So I'm very interested to know, are there examples that you can let us know, right? And my second question is around the role of the state, especially on the state government and the local governments, right? Do you see some examples anywhere that you have studied, right, where the government actually lends a helping hand in terms of bridging the gap? Because as we all know, when it comes to urban renewal, urban redevelopment on low income or even aging population or aging locations, right? There's always a knowledge gap, right, between developers who want to have commercial objectives versus the people who do not have that knowledge and are not able to negotiate for the best term that will lead to equitable outcomes, right? Thank you.
Okay. Hi, Doctor. Thank you very much. I'm Nurul Huda. Actually, I'm from Hulu Selangor Municipal Council. Okay. So, what I want to just to share from my perspective of municipal council, development is important. Okay, because we need job, investment, and economic growth. But however, we are also see the importance of preserving local identity and community continuity, okay, which is in Hulu Selangor. I take one example for the tourism development. We not increase the economic value, but also ensure the local community remain recognized, okay, which is we involve the economically included within the development ecosystem. And in our district also, actually we already established one of the program they call strategic partnership community tourism. So in the development, okay, we still give chance to the community to get involved. Okay, so the challenge, but we have also the challenge. The challenge for the local government today is not simply how to build better town, but how to ensure people still feel the belonging in the town was built. So this topic is very interesting because we need development by the time we need the community to make the town alive. Yeah. Thank you, Doctor.
Okay. Again, thank you so much for these excellent questions. So the case of civil servant house being rented out as service apartment. I mean, we know service apartments are costly, expensive, and I'm assuming the places used to be for civil servants, which must have been subsidized and much more affordable. Well, I guess I can only ask why. Why not put that in a? I mean, it's really coming down to the use of these assets that government control. What to make use of it, how to use it. Put that into what use. I mean, of course, sometimes government may want some of the properties to be maintained. In order to treat any distinguished visitors that they may consider important and treat them, so maybe they guest houses. I guess that's in a similar way. State guest houses are reserved for state visitors and so on. But then again, if it's for more kind of day-to-day use by people, I don't know whether it's for making more income, to address the gap in their fiscal, situations, and if it is meant to be raising money to put into some other more, some other uses that can benefit other communities. I don't know. So you probably need to look at what that purpose of that repurposing. What is the purpose of the repurposing of the civil servant accommodations is, and what that was actually entailing. Very often we see government engaging with some of the commercial transactions to raise money, and this is part of the process. You can see that also many in China as well. And by making use of government-linked companies that actually engage in the market, and that's pretty well known for China's own development. But that's also partly to address to use that as a way of expanding the government and fiscal foundations to raise revenues to put into other infrastructural use and so on and so forth. So I guess we need to look at that. But as my initial reaction, it would be why. Anyway, then the second question, heritage. Yes, I mean that's again an important issue that is becoming increasingly important now that in many places are trying to, and especially when these heritage in places are very often either in rural areas or areas which are losing population or areas which are losing other what is known to be more productive kind of employment, and therefore they see that as a way of kind of improving the local economy by attracting more visitors, and therefore it's becoming quite trendy. And every town, every city that goes through similar experiences, increasingly gearing towards that strategy, and that's pretty much the case in South Korea, in China, everywhere. I guess you just see that happening, especially in these countries with a long history. And therefore, the question is, as has been well extensively argued in the gentrification literature, many of these places do go through gentrification in a sense that many of these promotional activities that really make heritage transform into a commodity, really seeing that gentrification happening by increasingly turning the places into places for visitors. Now, the question then again is whether these changes are really involving local people to really stay as the owner of changes. And this is where there's a mixed kind of picture emerging. So many Chinese cities, especially in southwestern region, places, provinces where many of these tourism is emerging in rural areas. There's kind of rural gentrification literature that has been emerging in recent years, where many of these rural villages are turning into more heritage, tourism-friendly places for urban dwellers who want kind of weekend resort or holiday destinations to have a bit of rural experience or close to the nature. And many guest houses are emerging, and many of these guest houses are being basically pursued by urban dwellers, especially younger people actually in this case, from Beijing or Shanghai, who are running these guest houses by renting these places from rural villagers. So rural villagers basically taking some income from renting this out to guest house owners, operators, and guest houses basically turning that existing rural houses into guest houses to basically carry out the guest house business. It has a mixed outcome. So when this happens, rural villagers basically move out and they live elsewhere while enjoying the income from the rental business. And they increasingly see, oh, hang on, if I were to own the guest house myself, I could have raised more income rather than just the income from the renting. And so they also sometimes turn into guest house operators themselves. So there's a lot of these changes going on, which basically means that the rural kind of livelihood has been changing quite substantially. To what extent that actually produces a difficult situation for existing rural villages requires more questions, more investigation. One thing that I came across quite interestingly is how this inter-family dynamics has also been influencing very unequal situation between family members. So the rental income being basically managed by the head of household, usually the male head of household, while daughters and wives are left out, and therefore they see it as very unequal distribution of the benefits of the income within families, which creates own kind of difficult situation for families. So that's an interesting situation emerging. Whether they fully conform to what we may typically see as gentrification is probably more question mark to raise. but all of these are, also part of the heritage and related industries increasingly producing these dynamics, and many of these dynamics are increasingly seeing visitors and outsiders actually coming in to carry out and pursue these businesses, and that has also very uneven impact. So one study I did in Beijing was one of these very heritage in a neighborhood. And there's a huge kind of dissatisfaction and dissonance within the neighborhood because only certain streets are subject to this change, and many others behind the street are not seeing the change as well. So some people are basically seeing the change being very nuisance, or because of this concentration of visitors along this main street, it's noisy and people are making it, leaving rubbishes behind, and all this strangers walking about, and there's no privacy, and there's people complaining about this, and especially those people who don't really enjoy any economic benefit from the heightened kind of tourism situation. So yes, I mean, so it is a problematic situation. I guess this is coming back to the question of where who's really going, how this change is going to be pursued. And I think this is where communities really have to come together and have more conversation and debate about what that means to pursue this change. The other question about government Urban Renewal Act, the example, the honest answer is I don't have at the moment the example to give to you. After this, I may have to go and survey, and then maybe come across. But I will probably place my bet that many other similar acts elsewhere will probably be also having similar problems. So that's probably more likely. I might even start with the ChatGPT and say, can you survey Urban Renewal Act across the world and just give me something example? I would first suggest you do it and see what AI tells you in the first instance, and whether they hallucinate or not. There's a separate verification to be done. The examples, there are some examples. I mean, communities. So in Seoul, for example, not every mayor does that, but there was one mayor who I used to know quite well, who passed away now a few years ago. Used to promote kind of neighborhood, kind of a community enterprise, social enterprise type of community organization to emerge. So the idea was, with this support from the Seoul municipal government, with the budgetary support for the first 5 years, by this company set in a organized structure being set up in a community, in a neighborhood, where they actually invite community practitioners who have the experience of organizing communities to work there as an employee with some salary, and also to invite more experts to really come and work together. The idea was, during the 5-year period, they make the organization be more financially sustainable. While after 5 years, when the government financial support stops, but also trying to basically educate and encourage local community members to replace them, so that they actually become the owners of the company and the drivers. Now, while the idea itself was probably recommendable, it didn't really work eventually because there were all sorts of complications. Difficulty of involving local community members when they were really not affluent enough to really spare time to engage in this what can be a bit of voluntary work, giving up their employment elsewhere, and just engaging with this was already a bit of a challenge. And then the learning curve was not steep enough for them to be able to really understand what it means to organize and run this kind of business. And therefore, after 5 years, they was basically stopping and no longer. Financially sustaining such an organization was also problematic on the one hand, due to legal constraint about turning this into a profitable entity in the first instance. So what kind of business they can actually do, by using this kind of vehicle was facing a lot of constraints. There were many things that they couldn't do in terms of money generating activities. And therefore, they were becoming increasingly dependent on subsidies coming from the government. And that applying for constant subsidies wasn't a financially viable option. So there are many things which are beyond their control and beyond, which are not permissible by the existing governmental regulation or legal code, and therefore, which also raises the question of someone who really has to understand it, really has to really work on revising all of these and updating, which is not quite easy. Finally, and I understand all the time who we are running. The last in the question, strategic partnership, is the question from the local council. It is, I guess, it's probably more about, I guess I probably agree with many things that you may have, you have said about debating kind of strategic partnership for common tourism, whether what the tourism serves, right? Whether that can be structured in a way that can serve the interest of local communities. But that also requires the government to really create the space for them rather than excluding them. And that's not easy. And admittedly, having that kind of conversation, dialogues would involve a lot of contestations already. People have all different agendas they want to put on the table, and therefore you may see like, oh, is there any way of really coming to some sort of consensus? And this is why the consensus building is always not easy and straightforward. And government often face the challenges of the time within X number of years I have to show that is closely linked to their own legitimacy as well. In my own terms of office of 4 years, 5 years, I have to show something, leave some legacy to raise the chance of my re-election or my promotion, and so on. And very often that also means you don't really have the patience to really build that trust, to connect with different parts of communities and so on. So I think that's where the long-term commitment, who is locally embedded, even if they aspire to be politicians or government office holders, they really need to be rooted long-term in the local community to be able to gain the trust of people so that the conversation to initiate can start from a better ground. Thank you.
Well, I think that's a brilliant end to our session. We've run out of time, so we can't take any more questions, but I'm sure if there are any more questions, you can probably try to talk to Prof. Hyun during lunch. I will thank you, Prof. Hyun, for sharing your knowledge with us. I'll probably give it back to the MC of the event for the next sessions. Yeah.
Well, let me just thank all the invitations from IIUM and KRI, and also thanks to you for sharing. And thank you for listening this very lengthy, and thank you for all the wonderful questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Nurfaiza Mustafa, for moderating this session, and thank you to Prof. Hyun Shin for the enlightening and thought-provoking lecture. I may now invite both speakers to go back to your seat. Thank you. Dear guests, to conclude our program, please welcome Surveyor Dr. Soraya Ismail, the Director of Khazanah Research Institute, for the closing remark. Please welcome.
I know it's very late. You have your Friday prayers. I'm sorry, but we have food. Please makan and go for your Friday prayers. But I would like to thank the Dean. Thank you, Prof. Mariana. Thank you very much. KAED, what a wonderful, wonderful space. And Professor Hugh Bunching, thank you very much for giving us such a very, very good way of thinking about urban redevelopment. All the practitioners, thank you for coming. Hopefully you can email him all the time in order to get more foresight into this. And let's get all this engagement done continuously. in KAED, hopefully KRI in KAED. So thank you very much and enjoy the weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Surveyor Dr. Soraya Ismail, for the inspiring closing remark. May we kindly invite Dr. Soraya to remain for the presentation of the token of appreciation. Ladies and gentlemen, we shall now proceed with the token of appreciation ceremony on behalf of Kulliyyah of Architecture and Environmental Design and the Khazanah Research Institute. The floor now would like to invite Professor Hyun Shin, accompanied by Dr. Nur Fazia Mustafa, to receive the token of appreciation. Please welcome. I now invite Professor Town Planner Dr. Mariana Muhammad Osman to also receive the token of appreciation on behalf of Khazanah Research Institute. Thank you, Surveyor Dr. Suraya Ismail. May I kindly invite Professor Town Planner Dr. Mariana Muhammad Osman to present the token of appreciation on behalf of Kulliyyah of Architecture and Environmental Design, International Islamic University Malaysia, to Prof. Hyun Shin and Dr. Nur Fariza Mustafa. Please welcome. Thank you, Professor Mariana, and all our honorable speakers and guests. All distinguished guests, I would like to kindly request all of you to go in front of the stage in order for us to proceed with our photography session.